A claim keeps circulating about charisma, that one social skill beats every other one combined, and that skill is storytelling. It's a strong claim, and it happens to be testable. So here's what the research actually says about why stories work on a brain level, the specific structure that makes them work, and where the one skill beats all, framing, oversells it. Start with what storytelling even means here, because it's not just talking for longer. It's a structure, a hook that creates a question, rising tension, and a release. The same basic dramatic arc theorized by playwrights a century before anyone scanned a brain to check it. The first thing research confirms: a well-told story changes how the listener processes information, not just how much they enjoy it. Psychologists Melanie Green and Timothy Brock studied what they called narrative transportation, the state of being absorbed enough in a story that you stop critically evaluating it in real time. Transported listeners counter-argue less, resist the message less, and end up with attitudes that shift closer to the story's point of view. A well-told story isn't just more entertaining than a list of facts. It quietly lowers the listener's guard. There's a real chemical mechanism behind the emotional pull, too. Neuroscientist Paul Zach's research found that a story with genuine narrative tension triggers cortisol, the same stress hormone tied to distress, and that this tension is actually a precondition for what happens next. A release of oxytocin, the hormone tied to empathy and trust, once the tension resolves. In Zach's experiments, people who produced both hormones were measurably more likely to act generously afterward, and the amount of oxytocin released predicted how much they gave. Skip the tension, and you don't get the payoff. That's the actual mechanism behind what storytelling coaches vaguely call the emotional roller coaster, which explains why a technique like the false ending works. Psychologist George Lowenstein's information gap theory describes curiosity as a kind of cognitive itch. It shows up specifically when there's a gap between what you know and what you want to know, and that gap is uncomfortable enough that people will sit through an entire story just to close it. A false ending, letting the listener think the story resolved, then reopening it, reopens that gap on purpose. It's not a cheap trick. It's using a well-documented driver of attention on purpose instead of by accident. Here's the part that matters most if you don't think of yourself as a natural storyteller. None of this requires innate talent. Researcher John Antonakis ran controlled training studies where leaders were coached on a specific set of communication tactics, storytelling included, and then had their charisma rated by others before and after. The training produced real, measurable gains. Some participants scored up to 60% higher on audience ratings after training alone. Charisma, at least the communicable kind, responds to coaching the same way any other skill does. Now, the claim actually worth pushing back on: that storytelling alone beats every other social skill combined. Antonakis's list of what he calls charismatic leadership tactics includes 12 distinct tools. Stories, yes, but also metaphors, rhetorical questions, contrast, three-part lists, and expressions of moral conviction, among others. The biggest gains in his studies came from combining several of these tactics together, not from leaning on one of them in isolation. Storytelling is a genuinely powerful tool on that list. It is not the only one, and the research behind it doesn't support crowning any single tactic the undisputed champion. One more popular claim worth a quick correction while we're here. You'll often hear that stories are 22 times more memorable than facts. That specific number doesn't trace back to any real study. It's a widely repeated statistic with no verifiable source. The real research is still impressive without it. One well-known test found people recalled stories roughly 12 times more often than a single statistic. And more recent research shows the memory advantage isn't just about the initial recall. A story's influence on belief tends to fade much more slowly over time than a statistics does. So, a well-structured story, hook, tension, release, genuinely does more than entertain. It lowers resistance, triggers a real chemical arc tied to trust, and uses a documented curiosity mechanism when it's built with a gap instead of a straight line. And the ability to tell one isn't fixed at birth. It responds to practice like any other skill. What it isn't is a single move that replaces everything else you could learn about talking to people. The room usually isn't won by one skill. It's won by a few of them, used together, on purpose.